Welcome back. This lecture is going to give an introduction to modeling, mapping out reservoirs, sources, and sinks, and then we are going to cover the short-term organic carbon cycle. Let's get started. When we talk about cycles on Earth, we are tracing an element, like carbon, or sometimes a substance like water, through the Earth system. This is a type of modeling. There are reservoirs, which are physical locations that store various forms of the element or the substance in question. These could be things like the ocean, a lake, the atmosphere, rivers, forests, humans, or many more things as well. Processes that transfer the element or substance between reservoirs are called fluxes, and these consist of inflows, which flux things into the reservoir, and outflows, which flux things out. The balance between the inflow and the outflow determines how much of something accumulates in a reservoir. An important science that tracks elements in the Earth system is called biogeochemistry. It is a relatively young science, and it assesses the various reservoirs and the amounts of elements or compounds within them. It also assesses the processes that control the inflow and outflow on various timescales. Many compounds are cycled by both biological and abiotic reactions, hence biogeochemistry. Biological, geological, and chemical processes are all interconnected on Earth, and many feedbacks exist. That is to say, the biosphere interacts with the other spheres on Earth. And while there are many biogeochemical cycles which are interconnected, we are going to focus on the carbon cycle in this class. So where are the carbon reservoirs on Earth? The takeaways from the figure on the right are that the atmosphere contains about as much carbon as living things. It's the same order of magnitude. There is also a lot of carbon in the oceans in various forms and in rocks, including fossil fuels. And finally, there is a lot more carbon in fossil fuels than there is in the atmosphere currently, which is very pertinent to anthropogenic climate change and human fossil fuel combustion. Here's a great view of the carbon cycle on Earth that shows reservoirs and the fluxes. The black lines represent natural fluxes, whether that be inflows or outflows. The red lines represent human-caused fluxes. Humans began strongly influencing the carbon cycle with the Industrial Revolution about 150 years ago. Note that all the reservoirs for carbon are not actually shown on this image. For example, the limestone in sedimentary rocks is left out because it isn't as relevant to the short-term carbon cycle. So let's pick apart this image a little more and discuss how the idea of reservoirs applies to it. Sources and sinks are given with respect to a reservoir. This would be true even if it was depicting some other substance. The source is the inflow and adds a compound to a reservoir. The sink is the outflow and removes a compound from a reservoir. When sources equal sinks, the amount in a reservoir does not change. This is called a steady state. Looking at the carbon cycle, we can see that marine biota are in steady state because sources, 50 gigatons of carbon per year, equals the sinks, 11 plus 39 gigatons of carbon per year. Another concept that applies to modeling of reservoirs is the concept of residence time. Residence time is the average length of time an element or substance spends in a given reservoir for a reservoir in steady state. So it is the amount of a substance in the reservoir divided by either the inflow or the outflow. They are equal because the system is in steady state, so it doesn't matter which one you pick. For the box diagram on the right, the residence time is 2 years because you divide 20 gigatons by 10 gigatons per year. For practice, try and calculate the residence time for atmospheric carbon dioxide. Pause the video and try to calculate it. The answer is 12.7 years. To get this answer, you divide 760 gigatons of carbon by 60 gigatons of carbon per year. Now that we have learned about modeling reservoirs and seen a diagram of the carbon cycle, let's talk more about the short-term, also known as the fast, carbon cycle, which involves the cycling of organic carbon. This cycle operates over 1 to a few hundred years. Biomass, living and dead organic matter, on land and in the ocean, are at the center of the short-term carbon cycle. The carbon is primarily cycled back and forth from biomass to CO2 and back again. So CO2 and biomass are the main reservoirs, but methane is also an important gas to the carbon cycle that is not depicted here, and we will talk about that as well. There's a lot of gas exchange that takes place, so the atmosphere is heavily involved. So those reservoirs again are biomass and then CO2 and methane in the atmosphere. The diagram to the right shows the biological processes important to the short-term carbon cycle. You can see that it is mainly photosynthesis, respiration, and organic matter sedimentation. These processes are happening both on land and in the ocean, but now fossil fuel combustion is also contributing. Since biomass is at the heart of the short-term carbon cycle, let's talk more about what kind of life forms make up the reservoir of organic carbon on Earth. Plants account for a majority of the biomass on Earth. Bacteria make up the next largest portion. Remember, there are a ton of microbes on this planet, but they are really small, so by weight, they don't equal plants. Animals are a small minority of the total. Of animals, arthropods and fish are the largest groups. I included an image that shows some examples of the phylum Arthropoda if you're curious. You can see insects, crabs, spiders, and scorpions are all in this group. All of these animals have an exoskeleton. A majority of Earth's biomass is terrestrial, and this is because plants make up such a large proportion of biomass on Earth. There are almost no aquatic plants. However, a majority of protists and animals exist in the ocean. That's where a majority of phytoplankton live as well, though phytoplankton can also live in freshwater systems. And then a majority of bacteria and archaea live in the deep subsurface. Let's talk about the cycling of carbon through the biosphere. Remember that the two main reservoirs are CO2 and biomass, but we will talk about sources and sinks with respect to CO2 in the atmosphere here. Photosynthesis removes CO2 from the atmosphere and makes biomass, so it is a sink for atmospheric CO2. Again, photosynthesis is a sink for atmospheric CO2. Respiration consumes or removes biomass and makes CO2. So respiration is a source for atmospheric CO2. Respiration, whether it is aerobic or anaerobic, is still going to consume organic matter and produce CO2. So both are sources of CO2. I included a helpful diagram that shows the sources and sinks in red and the reservoirs for either CO2 or biomass in black. We can actually estimate photosynthetic biomass from space. This is possible because chlorophyll, which all photosynthesizers have, is a visible pigment. Since a majority of the biomass on the planet is photosynthetic, which are also the main biological sink for CO2, we can get a rough idea of where most of the Earth's biomass is. I said that photosynthesizers are the main biological sink for CO2 because there are forms of microbial chemosynthesis that act as a sink for CO2 as well. They just aren't nearly as important globally. When we think of photosynthesis, we tend to think of plants, but half of all global primary production occurs in the ocean. This is done by photosynthetic microbes known as phytoplankton, and they can be prokaryotic or eukaryotic. They don't make up as much biomass as plants. They are microbes, which are really small, but they get eaten very quickly. But they remove just as much CO2 from the atmosphere as land plants. Some of the organic matter goes to higher trophic levels. Most is eventually respired, meaning it is turned back into CO2. But some sinks to the sea floor and is removed from the atmosphere for long periods of time. Some organic matter is also caught in the microbial loop. This is a food web for microbes and is shown under the magnifying glass in the image to the right. Rather than zooplankton eating phytoplankton and fish eating zooplankton and so on up the food chain, heterotrophic bacteria eat phytoplankton, then viruses lyse open bacteria, and the organic matter remains so small that larger organisms can't access it. Only other types of heterotrophic bacteria are small enough to use it, and they get preyed on by more viruses. So the organic matter gets stuck in a microbial loop. There is a massive amount of organic matter on the planet that is so tiny it is useless to large organisms. A microbial loop and phytoplankton and all of this also occurs in freshwater systems as well. It's just on a smaller scale. Phytoplankton are at the base of all food webs and are at the core of the biological pump. The biological pump is the collection of processes that transport organic carbon produced directly or indirectly by phytoplankton near the ocean surface to the deep sea. You can see from the image all the trophic interactions, and some organic matter is respired and makes more CO2. But some organic matter, whether it is large phytoplankton, fish poop, or the dead bodies of whales, sinks to the bottom of the ocean. Most of that organic matter that sinks is respired, but is removed from the atmosphere until the water is upwelled again, which can take a millennium. But a tiny fraction of the fixed organic carbon can be further preserved at the bottom of the ocean. It gets buried and is stored in sediments on geologic timescales. And again, there is also organic carbon burial in lakes. It just isn't as widespread as it is in the ocean. Remember that a large portion of organic matter gets delivered to the bottom of the ocean, but is not buried. That portion is respired, but the CO2 doesn't re-enter the atmosphere until that water upwells. So this carbon is removed from the atmosphere until the global ocean conveyor belt brings it back to the surface. The cycling of deep water takes about a millennium to run its course, so the carbon could be out of contact with the atmosphere for that long. We have been tracking atmospheric CO2 trends using high-frequency measurements since the 50s, when Charles Keeling began measuring CO2 concentrations on the top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. From these measurements, we were able to see that CO2 concentrations are definitely trending upward. This is due to human activities like burning fossil fuels and cement production. But there is also a short-term annual cycle. This is due to the Northern Hemisphere's seasons. Remember that the Northern Hemisphere has more land mass than the Southern Hemisphere, and thus more plants than the Southern Hemisphere. So in the Northern Hemisphere's spring and summer, plants grow more. When plants grow, they complete more photosynthesis and draw down atmospheric CO2 levels. Then, during the Northern Hemisphere's fall and winter, plants slow down growth and shed leaves. This organic matter is decomposed or respired by heterotrophic microbes in the soil, which adds to atmospheric CO2 levels each year. Like I mentioned earlier, methane, CH4, production and consumption is also important for the short-term carbon cycle. In methanogenesis, which literally means the generation of methane, methane is produced by archaea that decompose organic matter in anoxic conditions. There is no oxygen, so no CO2 is made. The chemical equation is hydrogen plus CO2 makes methane and water, and that hydrogen comes from the fermentation of organic matter. In methane oxidation, methane is consumed by many different microbes that are growing chemoautotrophically. This is like photosynthesis, but the energy comes from redox reactions rather than the sun. The chemical equation is methane plus oxygen, though other types of oxidants can also be used, makes carbon dioxide and water. And methane oxidizers use the energy to make organic matter, which is not shown here, but that's why it is like photosynthesis. Note that there are other forms of chemosynthesis that also remove CO2 from the atmosphere, meaning they make biomass, but they are not nearly as significant as photosynthesis globally. I've included a time series of methane concentrations in the atmosphere. You can see that it is also increasing, and this is due to human activities as well. We kind of got a handle on emissions in the early 2000s, but then we kept increasing concentrations again. There is also a yearly cycle of atmospheric methane, similar to CO2. So where is all this methane coming from? Remember that methanogenesis occurs in anoxic environments by archaea that want to respire organic matter anaerobically, meaning in the absence of oxygen. If there is any oxygen in the environment, then the microbes that complete methanogenesis are actually poisoned and die, so they require completely anoxic conditions. So the two requirements for methanogenesis are anoxic conditions and lots of organic matter. Regions with high organic matter that are inundated by water, such as rice paddies, swamps, bogs, and more, tend to have anoxic conditions that favor methanogenesis. The map on the left shows terrestrial habitats where methane fluxes are estimated to be high in red. Note that there's a lot of methane fluxes in the tropics because it is wet and warm in these locations. The water causes soils to become anoxic, and the warmth increases metabolic activities like the decomposition of organic matter that exists in the soil there. High latitude regions are likely to increase methane fluxes in the future as ice thaws, causing soils to become waterlogged and anoxic. There are also methane seeps at the bottom of the ocean where methanogens decompose organic matter products in the sediment there. There is also a lot of methane trapped in ice, and as ice melts, it is being released to the atmosphere. Because methane has a much higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide, researchers burn it, turning it into CO2 before it can be released to the atmosphere. Our guts are another common source of methane. Ruminants like cows and sheep make quite a bit of methane, as methanogens help them to digest the grass and hay they eat. Measurements have shown that cow burps and farts contribute greatly to atmospheric methane, so farming and ranching is a significant contributor to methane emissions worldwide. Here's a diagram that shows the short-term carbon cycle again, with numbers for the reservoirs and fluxes added. Everything is in gigatons of carbon per year. The arrows show movement of carbon between the land, atmosphere, and ocean. Yellow numbers are natural fluxes, while red numbers are human contributions. Lastly, the white numbers indicate stored carbon removed from the atmosphere for long periods of time. And here it is with a box model added as well. These diagrams basically mean the same thing, though the box model is grouping all primary producers together rather than separating out terrestrial and marine like the image on the right does. The numbers might be slightly different too, since they were made by different researchers at different times. The picture on the right is easier for me to understand since it has so many visuals, while the model on the left is something that you would actually build if you were modeling a system or an elemental cycle. The picture on the right also doesn't have methane listed. It may be implied by microbial respiration and decomposition, but you don't know for sure. One quick note on the phosphorus and nitrogen cycles, since all biogeochemical cycles are connected in the Earth system. These two elements are necessary and very important for life. Because of that, their cycles are coupled to the carbon cycle. Nitrogen and or phosphorus are often the limiting elements or nutrients for photosynthetic growth, which means that a plant or algae or cyanobacterium could grow and photosynthesize more if they had more nitrogen or phosphorus. That's why we use fertilizer for crops. While nitrogen, dinitrogen gas, is abundant in the atmosphere, it is not available for most organisms. Some bacteria can fix nitrogen from the air. They make it into usable nutrients. This is done by cyanobacteria and certain bacteria that live in the roots of many types of plants. But it should be noted that no plants actually have the ability to do this. Plants can only have a symbiotic relationship with a bacterium that can do it. Now, the Haber-Bosch process, which is the artificial nitrogen fixation process, which turns dinitrogen gas into ammonia, changed all that and revolutionized agriculture. It also strongly interfered with Earth's natural nitrogen cycle. That is because fertilizers don't stay put. They run off and fertilize waters, causing phytoplankton blooms. Remember that nitrogen and phosphorus are often the limiting nutrients for systems. So this can lead to large-scale dead zones as heterotrophs respire all the organic carbon that was produced by photosynthesizers. And in doing that, these heterotrophs use up all the oxygen in the water. That concludes the material. Let's go through and review the main points. Biogeochemistry studies the cycling of chemical elements on Earth. Elements are cycled between spheres. With respect to studying a given substance, we define its reservoirs on Earth and the inflows, or sources, and the outflows, or sinks, of this substance to and from the reservoir. In steady state, sources are equal to sinks. Residence time is the average time a given substance or element spends in a reservoir. The atmosphere and the living biosphere contain approximately equal amounts of carbon, much less than some other reservoirs. Carbon is cycled through the biosphere via photosynthesis, chemosynthesis, and respiration and decomposition. These are key processes of the short-term, also known as the fast, carbon cycle. The short-term carbon cycle involves the biosphere, land and sediments, ocean, and the atmosphere, but the main reservoirs are the biosphere and CO2 and methane in the atmosphere. Half of all photosynthesis occurs in the ocean, and organic matter can either be funneled to higher trophic levels or enter the microbial loop. The biological pump is the collection of processes that transports organic carbon, originally produced by phytoplankton near the ocean surface, to the deep ocean. There is a yearly cycle in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations related to plant growth and senescence, but humans are causing an overall upward trend in carbon dioxide concentrations due to fossil fuel combustion. Atmospheric methane is also an important part of the carbon cycle, with both natural and human-caused emissions contributing to atmospheric concentrations. All biogeochemical cycles are linked, and an example of this is how fertilizer runoff can stimulate photosynthesis and the production of dead zones. Thanks for sitting through the lecture. To test your learning, I suggest you review the material and make sure you can answer these questions.